Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, partner here at Simpatico. I'm launching our climate.edu channel to help students learn about the degree programs that are training the future leaders of the green economy. I'll be interviewing graduate program leaders about the degrees offered at their schools, how applicants can best prepare, what to expect as a student, research and internship opportunities, and long-term career prospects. I'll also be asking renowned professors and grad students for their thoughts on the types of skills undergraduates should focus on developing as they prepare for a master's or doctorate program. And now, on to today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back to Climate EDU here on Simpatico. I am your host, Kayla Hathaway, and today it is my pleasure to have Dr. Matt Henry here to discuss just transitions through environmental humanities. He is a scholar in residence at the University of Wyoming, and his research is focused on how we can use environmental humanities in order to bolster social resilience in changing energy and environmental landscapes. Thank you so much for joining me today, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's great to be here.
Cool. To start off, I want to just go and ask, how has COVID-19 been affecting your work?
Oh, wow. Quite a bit, actually, although more so initially than recently. I think the rapid shift to online teaching was it was very jarring. And then I've been working on a book that sort of was delayed initially just because of that adjustment. And then in terms of doing research and other kinds of work here in Wyoming, it's been a little bit harder to make connections in communities just because it's difficult to travel, given the pandemic and everything. But at the same time, now that we have daycare again and so forth, I've been able to carve out more space to get work done. And it's also helped me think a little bit differently about my research in some ways. So in some ways, it's been generative, if really difficult.
Well, I'm really glad that there's at least some good coming out in thinking of ways to adjust work, especially for future in case something like this hopefully never happens again. But if it does, the processes are there, and also that's reassuring to hear that daycare is in place too.
Yes, it's been really helpful. Yeah, I think a lot of us in academia are experiencing challenges given childcare issues. It's been really hard. So
I've been seeing a lot of there's a couple of geologists that I follow on Twitter, and they were like, so how are we supposed to work?
Right. Yeah.
But
and of course that disproportionately impacts women too. And so that's I happen to be more at home, so I've been doing a bit more childcare, but I know it's a lot harder for women and people with more kids. I only have one daughter right now, so just recognizing that it's tough, but I don't have it nearly as hard as everybody else. So it's important to recognize. Yeah.
Well, I hope that your daughter has been having I'm sure it's probably an interesting time being home.
It is. I think it is. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we'll go ahead and jump directly right into our episode. So if you'd like to give us just a little bit of a rundown on what you do at your universities, what
Sure.
exactly is a scholar of residence and what does that mean?
Sure. So a scholar in residence is sort of a created title. My job was sort of created out of thin air. It's kind of like a postdoctoral research fellowship, except that I think my position has a little bit more leeway to pursue research avenues that I'm free to define myself. So I am actually appointed across 3 different academic units at the University of Wyoming as a scholar in residence. So my primary department is the Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources. And then I'm also appointed with the School of Energy Resources, specifically under the umbrella Center for Energy Regulation and Policy Analysis. And then the 3rd unit is the English department. So so when I tell people what I do, it's already just a paragraph to tell them what my academic appointment is, which is, it's fun to describe, and I get mealy mouthed and everything because it's just, I have to remember all the acronyms, right? And so my role here is to teach a class a semester, and then work on my book project, and then pursue research related to energy, and the humanities and environmental justice. And that's sort of been up to me to define, but what I've really tried to do is start working on a research program that's tailored to specific challenges facing Wyoming right now. After all, we're at a public research university, and our work should be, designed to serve the broader public and the communities in which we live and so forth. And so that's what I've been really interested in. And so that's looks like a number of projects I'd be happy to get into as well. And so that's kind of what I've been doing. And then teaching wise, I teach environment and society, which is a lower level course for students majoring in environment and natural resources, looks at the history of environmental thought in the US. And then the other classes I'm sort of free to come up with myself. So last semester in the spring, I taught environmental justice in literature and culture. So those are some of my specialty areas here.
I can only imagine how interesting environmental thought in the United States is for that kind of class, especially now.
It is. It's so interesting, and it's been really a challenge, but a good challenge this summer to sort of redefine or reorganize the course given COVID and given Black Lives Matter protests and so forth, and sort of trying to acknowledge, for instance, the fact that U.S. environmental thought has long excluded voices of color and people of color and different perspectives. And so it's been really fun to sort of be like, okay, this is the time to really think intentionally about how we teach this class here. And I hope it works well. I've changed a lot of the course content and so forth, and I'm eager to see what happens this semester.
Yeah, I would love to hear after the semester, maybe in the future if you're interested, about how that process was, like overhauling this course and the successes and other tweaks that could, like adjustments to be made in the future.
Yeah.
That I feel like that would be an interesting conversation.
Definitely.
But to go into like the big main topic, what exactly is environmental humanities, and how does it relate to just transitions in relation to like climate change and what we're seeing?
It's a great question. So environmental humanities can be defined in a couple of different ways, but the way I describe it always is it's a sort of transdisciplinary field. So it includes lots of people from lots of siloed academic disciplines doing work across disciplines, often in collaboration with each other, and really forging sort of new methodologies, new tools of analysis to think about environmental values, human beliefs, and how human beliefs and value systems impact environmental decision-making, can serve as obstacles for change, can serve as obstacles for community resilience and adaptation in the face of change and so forth. So at bottom, the field is really about an examination of values, and that can be done in a number of ways. Environmental humanities has a major background in the field of eco-critical literary studies, so looking at environment and literature, environment and religion, environmental history, anthropology, art. So there's a lot of different humanities fields that sort of fall under this rubric, and often, and even more and more lately, humanities scholars in the environmental humanities collaborate with people outside the humanities. So for instance, at the University of Wyoming, I work with economists and anthropologists, human ecologists, lawyers, policymakers. So it's really, I guess, if you look up interdisciplinary in the dictionary, I feel like environmental humanities should be right next to it, right? And so as far as this relates to just transitions or the concept of a just transition, I think that the environmental humanities have a really important role to play. Specifically, the environmental humanities are great at helping us diagnose environmental problems as they relate to human issues. So for instance, understanding things like pollution today, or the uneven distribution of environmental bads in, say, communities of color, but also the historical, the structural, the discursive reasons behind that, right? So what has actually led to, or what are the causes of this uneven distribution of environmental bads beyond the fact that it's just the way it is, right? And so it helps us diagnose in a more nuanced way those problems, but it also, and this is what I constantly advocate for, is that the environmental humanities help us envision alternative futures. They help us forge new narratives. They help us think outside of the sort of epistemological paradigms that we often get stuck in. And so that, to me, if we're talking about just transitions, transition is a fundamentally future-oriented way of thinking about things. We're thinking about the future. What's coming next? We're transitioning. And I think the humanities have a really important role to play in helping us imagine that and rethink how our beliefs and value systems relate to change, whether that's climate change, whether that's a changing energy landscape, and so forth.
So, in talking about the just the innate complexity of just transitions and trying to go and explain it to people. I noticed that just through Twitter and like in your own personal like profile, you mentioned that the importance of storytelling. And could you elaborate a bit on like why storytelling is so important in order to like address environmental humanities?
Sure. Yeah. So storytelling is one way for us to understand values, understand community values. So I talk about the way communities story themselves. So a basic way of looking at that would be like, okay, how does Wyoming view itself in the national landscape? Well, we could find that a number of ways. You could talk to people on the street. You could read novels or films about Wyoming. You could think about popular stereotypes about the state. You could look at artistic productions in the state. You could look at, what art people are producing, what types of clothes people wear. So you could think about a lot of different sort of ways in which meaning is expressed. And so when I say storying, I think of story very broadly, right? And so I think thinking about how communities story themselves or think of themselves or position themselves in relation to the broader state or the country, I think is a really important way to sort of distill down fundamental values in a community. And so storytelling is really important. I think in terms of thinking about the stories we've always told each other or told ourselves about our relationship to the environment or the relationship to the national economy, and then thinking about whether those stories are adequate to adapt to changing reality or whether or not we need new narratives or new stories, right? So I kind of think of storytelling really broadly in that way.
No, I think that's a really good approach to it though, because if we're talking about like just if you're looking at humanities in general, like just what that field even entails, it's like art and music and literature and speech making,
Right.
like live streaming, like it encompasses a bunch of different mediums. And so I think that wide view is a good way to approach it, as opposed to trying to like tunnel vision your way into a corner and then being like, oh wait, this isn't where I was supposed to be.
Right. Yeah, it is, but it's also hard because once you sort of expand that realm of analysis, then it's like, okay, where do I go now? And so it's also like really hard to think about things in such a broad way, which I think is why collaboration is so key to the environmental humanities, is because traditionally in humanities fields, if you're talking about specifically within academia, you do a lot of solo authored articles and books, and it's sort of a narrow form of research output. And in the environmental humanities, increasingly, I think collaboration is key. Bigger projects, longer term projects that take more time to sort of say build relationships or think deeply or do what I call slow scholarship. It's just really key to sort of address these wicked, really complex problems.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that point as well, for sure. So I wonder then, so right now when the term like just transition gets mentioned, a lot of the time the solutions offered are like a hyper emphasis on like technology or economics and policy. And do you feel that that's starting to change as we address like social issues, like we've seen with BLM bringing a lot of attention to the disproportionate effects of, and also COVID, the disproportionate effects of our environment and just some people, like people in it, and how that can dramatically affect environmental health and public health. Do you think we're seeing more conversation now?
That's a good question, and I'll see if I can answer it in a way that makes sense. So
Okay.
there's two ways I look at I feel like just transition is being used right now. And one is specifically in relation to thinking about programs or policies that are put in place to help fossil fuel workers in communities dependent on the extractive economy transition, given that the coal markets are declining, oil is in turmoil, and renewables are making a major, are becoming more and more prevalent. And so this is essentially making sure that communities that have long sort of powered our country, lit our homes, lit our streets, are not left behind when there's a specific energy transition. And so those are very technical solutions. It might be worker retraining. It might be education fund. It might be something to stimulate programs to stimulate entrepreneurship, investment in local businesses. On the other hand, the concept of a just transition has a lot older history, and it is rooted in labor protections and helping communities transition beyond pollutive industries. It's rooted in the 1970s, 80s labor movement, but also in the environmental justice movement, which sort of started coming around more broadly in the 1980s. And that just transition in the environmental justice space is often more broadly conceived to think about things like redress for past harms, things like addressing the theft of indigenous lands or the legacies of slavery in communities of color and so forth. And so the environmental justice movements have been using the arts, or have been thinking about change through the arts for a long, long time. There's a very rich history of that. So there's actually a book behind me I'm just noticing now as I'm talking. It's Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger, which just came out from Julie C. And it talks in a really concise way about how the arts and thinking about change from humanities perspectives have long been central to environmental justice struggles, and also activist scholars that sort of work on both sides, both work with community organizations and also in academic institutions. And so what I think I'm seeing is that continuing in environmental justice spaces, but less so in relation to the energy transition. So when we talk about just transitions specifically like related to coal communities or energy, there's not a ton of humanities specific engagement with just transitions. And so I think that's a gap that I think we need to address. And that's part of what my work addresses. But it is there. I think the term just transition is been around a while, but it seems like it's entering popular discourse a lot more. And I think that needs to be married to thinking about change in ways that aren't just policy or economic or technical and so forth. So like, you look at the text of the Green New Deal, House Resolution for a Green New Deal, just transition is in it. You look at Tammy Duckworth's recent, I think she had a Marshall Plan for Coal Country plan that just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's very much based on just transition policies and so forth. And that's awesome. And I think that what I think there needs to be more of is humanities type engagement with energy just transitions in general. But from an environmental justice perspective, that type of work has been going on for a while.
Yeah, and talking about like transition in coal and fossil workers, I think I saw one of your papers was addressing that transition for residents in Wyoming.
So actually not in a way, I am working on something on that right now, but it's not out yet.
Okay.
So I have done work on that in Appalachia. And what I should say is Appalachia's been like, so West Virginia and so forth, they've been dealing with energy transitions for longer than we have in Wyoming. The coal industry is older there. The industry's been declining. Well, not necessarily declining, but it hasn't been good for workers and communities for a really long time. And so the humanities there have been used more richly to imagine like an alternative Appalachia, but not always in the context of just transition rhetoric, right? So what I think in Wyoming, I think it would be great to sort of have those humanities perspectives as we think about theories of change and so forth. Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to reading it when it's published.
Thanks.
Cool. So another thing that I wanted to just talk about before we wrap up. This has been blowing by. It's already like 20 minutes in.
I know.
So if you had to pick one, like just one key point when it comes down to discussing just transitions and environmental humanities with someone who might just be like, about it, like say I'm talking to someone about the Green New Deal and why providing the transition for oil rig workers to have the opportunity to work on the green grid, like why that's important, that that's even an opportunity that should be made.
So if you're asking why the environmental humanities would be important to persuading people, is that, I just want to make sure I'm getting the question right.
Yeah, or to have like a
Mhm.
good discourse conversation as opposed to like, well, we just have to do it because like climate change.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the question would be, how do you want, what do you want the future to look like? Like, think really hard about that. And I know that's not on its face, that's a really basic question, right? But I think that's the question I think we constantly need to be asking ourselves that, what do you want the future to look like? And, in the social sciences, the specific type of research that might do that would be scenario planning, right? So you have people sitting around a room planning scenarios. You toggle these different types of metrics, what it might look like in 2050. But I think when you have a conversation with actual stakeholders, people, community members, workers, I think that's where you can really get at and help drill down on values and how those inform what the future looks like. So I think that would be my question: is what, honestly, what do you want the future to look like? Is it economic prosperity? Is it, in Wyoming, is it really healthy ungulate populations so you can hunt, healthy fisheries so you can fish, because there's, lots of people treasure the outdoors here, but also are engaged in some industries that might ultimately, not exactly help fisheries or public lands thrive, right? So I think that would be the question: is what do you want the future to look like? And then I think a follow-up question would be, how do we get there? So yeah.
I would like for us to have no plastic in the ocean.
I I too would like that. And I think that's the thing, is like, it's hard. I think that brings up an interesting point, because I working it specifically and talking in communities, I think, is a really important way to think about just transitions, rather than doing academic research, because when you ask people these questions, they can look around and actually envision what a future might look like. Whereas, like, no reasonable person would want more plastic in the oceans, but also, like, it's hard to see or wrap your head around what that looks like, what the problem is. Whereas, like, in communities, at the community level, I think it's easier. So
Oh yeah, like that was a really big thing. Like short tangent here. In my environmental justice class I took, we were talking about how different communities have different environmental needs, and that's part of the reason why a lot of like green narrative seems so like separate, because there's so many things going on all at once,
mhm, mhm,
and we need to focus more um, local, and then if everyone's focusing on their actual local problems, because like
mhm, mhm,
um, a great example is like, oh, like California has wildfires, so why would someone in Florida care about what's happening in California? They
mhm,
don't have fires, or
mhm,
as far as I know of. And then Florida gets cyclones, but California doesn't. So why would we really care about a cyclone policy? Because that doesn't affect us. And then like in terms of the oceans, it's like, hey, how about we like just stop using straws? As silly as
right.
that was, like that was
Mhm,
such an. I would love to see like any case studies that came out of that, is like why that picked up so rapidly and why it seemed to be like just this massive movement where everyone
mhm,
got
mhm.
behind like, yeah, no straws. And I'm like, that's fascinating how like everyone latched onto that. Um, so I'm curious to see if we can like promote that kind of movement with other like things as we get bigger, like plastic bags and then plastic bottles, which eventually
Yeah.
we'll have to take on the bottling industry. But
Right. Yeah. I think you're getting at the heart of, I think, a big challenge of this, right? Is like, we often talk about just transition to clean or renewable energy grid. And that's just, obviously, that's such a desirable goal, but it's also a big one. And so I think that it needs to happen locally, and the real work needs to happen locally, because I agree that, like, I'm not an expert on theories of how, social change, like, say, why did plastic straws take off versus, you know, um, you know, other, electric vehicles or whatever. But I think that work needs to happen locally, and I think that's, after that happens, then you can maybe sort of forge alliances or coalitions across board and across from different communities and so forth, based on shared experience or shared view of desirable futures and so forth. But I think a ton of that work needs to happen on the ground. Environmental justice movement does that, right? There's I think in terms of just transitions, the transition is still happening, right? But I think, again, like, it needs to happen very much based on local interactions with people and an attention to local dynamics. So
Absolutely. That's why I'm really proud to see like movements like Sunrise, and I'm sure there's a bunch of others too. Like I just remember Sunrise because we actually have a local chapter here, so I see them like out and about quite often. But um, so nice little comments from chat for you. Adisa is saying that this was really quite interesting. So much of sustainability discussions come from natural sciences, but I very rarely heard what it means in the humanities. And Mike is also like, equality of environmental well-being would be nice.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes,
Mhm.
it would be nice. I agree.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up our episode
Okay.
here. We'll move back in. Oh, Mike just posted a question. All right.
Okay.
Here we go.
I'm ready.
So Mike is asking Matt, due to the fact that this is such a consequential year for many of us, how can storytellers seize this moment effectively? What should storytellers be doing more of?
I think storytellers should be going full throttle on thinking about alternative futures and desirable futures. And why I say that is because right now seems like we have an incredible window to sort of re-envision what things look like. I mean, COVID has made it. I mean, we now know that it's possible to do things like, mass mobilization for social distance. I mean, obviously there are issues with that, right? But for a few months, everybody shut down, and we had there's a massive stimulus bill, and people, and so there's some evidence now that all this resistance to massive government intervention to help facilitate something like an energy transition is totally possible, right? Who knows what's going to happen or what post-COVID looks like, but I think that's so much up in the air right now that I think storytellers should really be working hard to think about that and communicate that more and just continue doing what they're doing, but maybe turn the volume up even more, because I think right now we have a really unique opportunity to forge a different future. And we talk about this in Wyoming too, is fossil fuel revenues are in free fall, and the future of the state is so much up in the air. Well, I think now is the time we have these conversations, and we tell these stories, and we think through very hard what we want the future to look like. So I would just say, keep doing it, be imaginative, throw all kinds of ideas against the wall, see what sticks, and then talk with others. So
It's like, hey, no air pollution would be great. Okay, thanks.
yeah, right. Hey, I mean, I mean, I really think, I think there's there's so many opportunities right now.
Yeah.
And so, things that even, we might be cynical about, could be possible. So that's what I mean, I think it's a terrifying, but also some hope
Yeah.
right now. There's, if you can think about it that way, I think there is.
Mhm. And we'll take this question from Ken, then we'll move into
Okay.
the just chatting where we wrap everything up.
Sure.
He was asking, what types of internships would you be looking for if you were an undergraduate student right now?
Good question. So I just had a student. It was kind of an internship / course. It was with the Grand Canyon Trust, and it was focused around organizing and just transition activism in the Colorado Plateau and desert Southwest region of the United States. And she said it was a terrific opportunity. And she didn't just she thought she would learn more about just transitions and environmental justice issues down there. But what she really learned were a bunch of really important skills with regard to organizing, coalition building, environmental politics. She even learned a little bit about lobbying and advocacy. And so I think I would be looking for that. I would be looking for internships that really focus on organizing and advocacy around, if you're interested in just transitions, around Green New Deal or Green New Deal adjacent policy and programs, because I think there's more and more and more of that. Hopefully there will be more opportunities for that after November, in terms of, but there's there's a ton of enthusiasm and activity in that space. And so I would be looking to learn how to work in the advocacy or organizing space. That's where I would look for internships. So environmental nonprofits, social justice nonprofits, that sort of thing. Yep.
Like the, I think NR Natural Resources Defense Council deals with environmental law and a lot of justice stuff, earth justice too. Yeah, there's a lot of good organizations.
Yeah, I mean the national ones for sure, and also there's also a number of just local ones, local chapters. There's I mean you kind of have to stay on top of it and wait for things to pop up, but that's what I would go into that space. There's a ton of energy, and right now everybody's thinking about things intersectionally, so you can kind of pick your what kind of social justice area do you want to go into. I mean I think there's a lot of opportunity to sort of follow your passion. In terms of internships and getting experience, you might not, make a mint of money, but there's a lot of opportunities for experience.
True. So. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this episode today, Matt. I look forward to reading your paper and also your book. You said yes.
It's is hopefully ideally coming out next year. So we will see, but thanks. Yeah.
Awesome.
So
all right. Just hang on one moment. We're going to transition into just chatting.
Okay. Sounds good.